So good evening, everybody, and welcome. Welcome here in Marchelle Church. Welcome to those who are joining us online from all over the country. So good to have you back here for week 2 of our Lent series, Our Land, Digging Deep in Search of Common Ground. I'm just going to do a very brief introduction and then hand over to these two wonderful people to my left, Marchelle Farrell and Sam Ewell. Just a reminder that this series is about addressing 3 intersecting themes. One is about the racial divisions and economic injustice of our society, the dividing lines which separate us and which obscure the common grounds that we have, and particularly obscure the common grounds in shared experience of economic injustice. The second is a sense of our disconnection from common land. We know here in Marchelle that, for example, our local River Tame is fenced off for 3 miles across our area. And so something that is a kind of flowing lifeblood through our community is something that we can't access as local people. A symptom of a much wider issue of privatization of land, for the benefit of some and the exclusion of others. And then the third theme that cross-cuts all of these is a sense that there are histories that have been buried deep in the soil that we need to unearth and rediscover. And in unearthing those histories, there's an invitation for us to reconnect with the soil, to literally get our hands dirty as we discover the shared gift of life that it is for us. So that's something of why we're here, something of the thread running through this series. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Marchelle Farrell. I read Marchelle's book, Uprooting, about 3 years ago when it first came out. And it resonated with all kinds of things which were live for me already. Concerns and griefs that I was feeling at that point, but also an awakening to a sense of possibility as well, a sense of hope rooted in the soil. And so when I emailed speculatively asking Marchelle if she'd be up for joining us, and she replied with a big yes, I was absolutely delighted. Just a tiny bit about Marchelle from the back of her book. Marchelle is a therapist, writer, and amateur gardener. Born in Trinidad and Tobago, she spent the last 20 years attempting to become hardy in the UK. She's trained and worked as a consultant psychiatrist and psychotherapist. When not neglecting it for the care of her young children or her work in the community, Marchelle spends much of her time getting to know her country garden in Somerset and writing about the things that garden teaches her about herself. Her book is Uprooting: From the Caribbean to the Countryside, Finding Home in an English Country Garden. And if I may, I just want to read a little bit now just to kind of set the scene. About halfway through, and this is writing in the midst of the COVID pandemic and in the year when George Floyd was murdered and Black Lives Matter as a movement was bubbling up again. We are living through a mass trauma, but the garden seems to have turned on something in my DNA, reactivated some deep remembering of relationship with the land. And I found that with a joy as deep as the pain of the moment we're living through, the land remembers me. Every morning as I step out into the garden, I feel overwhelmed with gratitude for its all-encompassing grounding, to which I give myself over to hold body and mind safe. The garden holds me on its lap, cradles me against its dark skin, gently brushes fingers of leaves and petals and twigs against my cheek and through my hair. Sometimes it feels as if the garden loves me. So that's why I invited Marchelle to be with us tonight. And who better to be in conversation with her than our dear friend Sam Ewell, who is rooted these days in the soil of Birmingham and in all kinds of ways, who we first met in Hodge Hill about 7 years ago now, when Sam came to our Harvest Festival service with his wormery and with some surplus food, which inspired the Real Junk Food project that we have engaged in here, which turned into our pantry. Sam has helped us compost and fall in love with composting, and he has helped sow some of the seeds, quite literally, of our community garden here, which is developing in exciting ways this year through our interfaith partnership. So with a shared passion for gardening and with a shared sense of coming to English soil and finding ways to make themselves at home in it, I'm delighted to hand over to Sam and Marchelle. Can we give them a big round of applause?
Thank you, Al, for that wonderful introduction. It's and what a treat to be here with you and with all of you and you online. It's really a double joy, a double blessing for me, because as Al said, I mean, we're here to listen and be in conversation with you, and I've been reading your book, and to meet you IRL in person is a real blessing. It's also a blessing to be in this place, in this church, on this land, with faces and friends that I know. I spent 2 years of my working life, that was from 2022 to 2024, as a green connector with Open Door, and spent about 2 mornings a week in the back garden as a green connector. And in case you're wondering what is a green connector, if a gardener and a community organizer had a love child, it would be a green connector, right? Yeah. And so it's great to be back. And I really want to set you up to talk about your book. If I could do it, is it all right if I quote you to yourself, quote you back? Al read a bit, but really I wonder, Al, you set us up so beautifully with these threads around identity, race, land, and history. And I just wondered if we might, as an entry point into that, reflect on a dominant theme in your writing, which is home, right? And that bridge, it's a bridge concept between identity and that inner landscape, but also the place you stand, the soil you're on. So I just wanted to read 2 little bits, especially for those who might not have read it. But you begin, this is on page 4 in Uprooting, and you start in Trinidad and Tobago, and you write, "What is home? I have been trying to make sense of the word, to find some belonging in it since I left my childhood one in Trinidad and Tobago 20 years ago. The place I grew up in, that old colonial tropical paradise, seemed to my unfurling teenage self unbearably narrow and small." So you start there, and then if you turn the page, it's only 1 page, but you time travel into your adult life, and you write this about being in English soil. "Then slowly things happened to ground my heart here in England too. Marriage, 1 child, another, each loving kiss, a new rhizome seeking to bed down in impervious English soil. As my family grew, so did a yearning to settle and take root, to be held and grow strong and belonging. The idea of home began to leave me confused, my heart torn. I bandied the word about. I left home to return home. I missed home while being at home." So with those bookending where you began and your first home and the place that's become your home, I would really just want to pass it to you with a Rumi question, and you can take it where you want to go. Where's home for you now? Where is home, or what is home for you?
Thank you so much, both of you, for those beautiful and generous introductions. And what a treat to be in this space, in this place, speaking with all of you here and thinking with those of you online as well. I hope you can feel the energy. I hope it comes through the screen. That's such an interesting and important question. And it makes me laugh every time I marked it because when I had handed in the first draft of the book, feeling really pleased and proud of myself, here I was going to be a published author. I'd written a book, I'd completed it, yay, me. And all four of us were in the car, bundled together, driving somewhere at the weekend. And a conversation about home came up and what the meaning of it. And my son said something about, do you know, I think I know what home is. And I said, do you really? And at the time he would have been, I don't know, quite young, maybe 6 or 7. And I'm thinking, I've just written a whole book about it, but sure, like let's hear your ideas, whatever they might be. And he said, I think home is when you with the people that you love and who love you. That's really home. And it really hit me. And I sort of sat there and thought, oh my God, like I've spent a year and a half like wrestling over this manuscript, and really I just needed to ask my child. And the wisdom is the kind of infinite wisdom of that, because I suppose that is home. Really, home lies for me in the hearts of those who love me, but I suppose it's taking that concept beyond the human realm, which is the way in which we tend to think about it, that those who love me are only the other people in life. And I suppose that was the leap that I had to make. That was the struggle that I faced when I first moved here and felt England to be very hostile in many ways, as a sort of Black immigrant attempting to ground myself in this place. And for a long time, my reaction to that was to reject the notion of needing to feel rooted or of needing a home. I was like, well, I'm young. I'm not going to stay in this place anyway. The weather's terrible. The food is worse. Like, who's going to, like, why would I stay here? I'm just going to come, get my degree, move on with my life, go somewhere else. I'm a citizen of the world. My father always used to tell me when I was a child, the world is your oyster. I think he regrets saying that now that I don't live next door to him at home anymore. But then I had children of my own and became really overwhelmed with the need to feel as though I did have roots, actually. I started to understand that that sense of myself as not needing to be rooted was a defense against the discomfort that I felt in trying to put down roots here. And it was never, it was very infrequently actually on the interpersonal level. We're talking about systems, interacting with visa systems, interacting with work systems, interacting, at the systemic level. They always felt this pushback, this rejection, a sense of not being wanted, of not being good enough, no matter how hard I tried, no matter the quality of my qualifications, still. And it was only when I landed in this garden and it was at that very particular point in time, I suppose, because it was COVID. And so I couldn't come into a relationship with the people in my new neighborhood. I couldn't come to feel that I belonged through the way that I had always thought of coming to feel that one belonged, as by forming relationships with friends and neighbors. And all of that was stripped away within just like 2 months of us moving there. So I had to think differently about how I could be in relationship with the place. And I found myself having the experiences in the garden as I worked in the soil and existed in the soil, was in the space, that really started reminding me of my work as a therapist. And I got really curious about that, about how it felt as though this place could hold me, could help me process feelings and thoughts and bring coherent narrative at times when I felt really disordered and scattered, and regulate me and all of that I had only thought about in the context of the interpersonal kind of, therapy relationship. And it was a curiosity about that, about what this relationship with place could potentially do, that got me writing, and that, you know, led to this book. And I always say that the garden really is a co-author of this book. Like, I wouldn't have written this particular story if I hadn't been in relationship with that very particular space. But it was that sense of beginning to realize that not only could the garden hold me in that way, but that actually in being in this intimate reciprocal relationship with the place, with the plants, with all the creatures in the place, with the robin that will always come and start hopping around whenever I go out there, with the worms in the soil, with seeing them multiply as I cared for the soil, you know, as all of that happened, I started to get the sense of the garden loving me, and thought, well, actually, if home is being in the hearts of those, being, you know, with the hearts of those who love you and having them in your heart, actually, aren't we always at home? We're human animals who belong to this earth. This earth is our home. You know, in a very profound way, we belong wherever we place our feet, you know. And actually, as humans, we've always been nomadic species. You know, we're a species who, we're curious, we move around, we travel. Like, we've made habitats out of this entire planet, you know, some places that feel really impossible. People live there. People have adapted and have found ways of making life vital, thriving societies for themselves in you know, in all sorts of habitats. And really, that's about understanding that relationship of being loved by the place in which we are. And you know, when we can remember that we are loved by the earth, I think that really gives us a sense of grounding and of home, and really of hopefulness, when things in the systems and structures that we have created, the kind of stories that we tell ourselves to create these systems and structures that we have made up to form our society, when they can feel really quite grim and dark and hopeless. For me, I find that as a way of remembering myself to a more hopeful place.
There's a lot there, and thank you for tying it back to that heart space, the story of your son. And I just wanted to pick up on one thing that's, it's in your book, and it's also in the way you speak, this agency and being in relationship. The garden is not just static landscape. It's not just scenery or backdrop. It acts on us. It moves us. I think I've got another quote here that I wanted to, you write, "I go out into the dark garden, I touch the earth touches me, I'm a creature, I feel a charge of love surge through me." So I was just fascinated by that sense of agency, being in relationship with the more than human, and the healing aspect of that sense of touch, that something about touch that it acts on you. It's that you touch it, but are you willing to be touched? And I just wondered if you could open that up a little bit more, and around, you can take this where you want, but I think the question behind that is, what would you say is the relationship, as you're trained as a therapist? I think you describe yourself as an amateur gardener. You do it out of love, but you're a gardener. What's the relationship there between that healing touch and the practice of gardening?
That's such an interesting question. And yeah, I use the term amateur very deliberately because of the roots of the word amateur, you know, someone who does something out of love, out of the love of the act. People always think I'm putting my gardening skills down when I use that. And I mean, I'm always learning. I don't claim to be, I don't even know what is a good gardener, because you're right, the garden has agency, has a lot of agency. And I found that I still have a huge amount to learn. You know, I will constantly fall into old patterns of thinking and look at a bed and think, I want it to look this way at the height of summer. I want pinks and I project a vision, my vision for how this bed is going to be. The plants have their own ideas. Absolutely. Just today, actually, I was out and I was tidying up some steps that we have, and I noticed that a thyme that I had planted very neatly within a sort of little box at the side was no longer in there, but was all over the steps. And I thought, well, I guess it'll smell really nice underfoot as we walk up and down these steps. This is where it's chosen to be. So yeah, the garden absolutely has its own sense of agency. The idea of touch is it's a really interesting and it's one that interests me a lot. There's a sort of, I laugh a lot at the ways in which we have to use science to prove to ourselves things that we should know about ourselves as animals who inhabit this planet. And so we go off and we use science to tell us that, oh, there are these special bacterium in soil that when we interact with soil and we get these bacterium on our skin through methods that we still don't quite fully understand, these bacterium change the serotonin levels in our bloodstream and in our brains, and therefore make us happier. They influence our mood. Our mood is literally influenced by coming into contact with healthy soil, these bacterium within healthy soil. And you kind of think about the millennia that human animals have spent in evolving in contact with the natural world around us. Of course, it makes us feel good to be in contact with the natural world around us. Not just humans.
Chickens, if you've ever seen them, they're cleaning themselves.
But they're making themselves feel good. Exactly. We aren't the only species that does it. You're completely right. So yeah, that's just one of the bits of proof that we have for ourselves about touch. But also, we need touch. Again, the science that we teach ourselves to prove things that we already know. There's studies about mothers and babies, and babies with hard mother creatures are much less happy and settled. They much prefer soft mother creatures, even if the hard things feed them more, or meet their physical needs more. They will still want the comfort of that loving touch. The stuff about how the importance of skin to skin, and a newborn baby, there's a patch of skin on a mother's chest that can regulate a newborn baby's temperature. Touch is absolutely vital to us as a species. And one of the things that can cause a baby to fail to thrive is a lack of touch, which is something that, again, we've had to teach ourselves through science. And now that's why NICU units really place a lot of importance on touch. You don't just leave the babies in these sterile containers untouched for hours and hours. They have to be interacted with, or else they won't grow. So touch is literally a thing that we grow in response to. Like plants. You would know about seedlings. If you're starting seedlings off inside, you're encouraged to touch them, to brush them gently. Yeah, but that helps them grow stronger and more resilient and into stronger plants through the act of being gently touched. So we need to come into contact with the rest of the world around us. It's a core need of ours. And, I can find some of the narrative around gardening as therapy to be a bit reductive in the way that we can, as a species, often reduce things. There's a lot about green prescribing and what dose of green does one need in order to get a beneficial impact. And I find that language uncomfortable because I think about it as its relationship. And for me, when you frame it like that, you're putting it back into an extractive relationship. How much can I take from this green space that will make me feel better? Rather than actually, if I enter into a reciprocal relationship of care with the rest of the natural, it's in the language that we use, that others the green space, instead of thinking that actually you and the rest of the space are one and the same, And when I get into my more kind of mystical moments, sitting outside in the garden, I like to remember how porous we are, really. How actually at our most basic level, on one way of thinking about it, I'm not an eye. Trillions of microorganisms make me up. They cover my skin, they line my gut, they're and I wouldn't be healthy without that population of microorganisms doing what they do for me. And when I come into contact with the soil, the ecosystem that is me comes into contact with the ecosystem of the soil and is changed by it and enhanced by it. But also, even when you go much more basic than that, I'm a collection of atoms that are just a bit more tightly bound to one another than the atoms in the air that I'm breathing. And I'm in constant exchange with that. I breathe in and these oxygen atoms come into me and they are incorporated into my flesh, and I breathe out and the carbon dioxide atoms go out of me and they're incorporated into the flesh of the tree that is nearby. And so we are in this constant cycle of exchange, of interdependence, of interbeing. We are constantly in this state of being touched by the world and touching the world.
And the way you describe that relationship, it just made me think, I think it's at the very beginning of the book, you quote Robin in Braiding Sweetgrass, if you've heard of the book, but the quote is, "All flourishing is mutual. All flourishing is mutual." And you just, again, in your writing and just off the cuff, the way you talk about that relationship is so profound. And it's also hearing you, there's different languages that we have as humans to name what's always been there, right? I mean, there's the scientific language. If you need to know the scientific reason, yes, microbes in the soil cause us to release serotonin. I think it was in 2015, they actually had a study about this. I always tell kids that when I'm doing gardening, if there's no nettles here, just leave your gloves off, and I often do that. And then they're like, okay, yeah. But that's a scientific kind of very headspace language. Then there's a heart space of that sense of intuition, that relationship of mother-child, of just touching the earth because it's primal. And in my tradition, we have language. We talk about the soil as, I don't know a lot of Hebrew, but most of it is on my right arm. I don't know if you can see that here, but show and tell moment. This tattoo, it says Adamah. So Adam, which is representative of humanity, God created Adam from Adamah. It's actually a pun in Hebrew. The earth creature, the one that God took from Adamah. That's how primal this relationship is. So I put it here as a reminder when I'm doing that. Yes, I'm not meaning to be extractive as if I need 15 minutes of green today. And then there's just a longing there, right? There's an ache. There's a longing to say, I'm created from this. We mark ourselves at the beginning of Lent. From this you have come and you will return to it. And so thank you for bringing us in to that relationship and naming some of the ways that it is a mystery, isn't it? That it's real, and we try to find language to talk about it. I wondered, we've talked about it, certainly not in an extractive way or just what we can get out of it, but I also wanted to bring us back to, yeah, there's the all flourishing is mutual. There's that sort of way of naming that mystery, that relationship, but Al has also framed this as a way of naming the brokenness. And I wondered if you could talk about a little bit. I'm just going to set you up with a couple of quotes that aren't yours this time. But this has to do with this inner landscape and the outer landscape, what's happening inside of us and the soil that we touch, what happens in the garden. A friend of mine, a Muslim friend, and they're in Ramadan, she changed her Facebook or WhatsApp profile. There's a Rumi quote, and the quote goes, "Yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, so I'm changing myself." That's a Rumi quote. And that made, when I read that, I go, I remember when I did permaculture design training a few years ago. And in permaculture, it's all about observation and interaction, and you're designing and working with these patterns. Again, not meant to be extract, but you're working with these patterns. But you do all this, but my teacher said, talk about zones. So zone 1 might be your house. Zone 0 is your house. Zone 1 is your kitchen right outside the doorstep. Zone 2 might be where you keep your chickens if you have animals. Zone 3, in my case, in the city, would be the park behind my house. But you see, you radiating zones, and you think about, what can I shape? What can I touch? And then she ends the course saying, there's zone 0. That's this. Don't neglect this, because projects don't stand or fall because someone designed the apple tree 1 meter away from maximum sun. They fall apart because people are edgy. People are also broken. So I'm just setting those 2 quotes to invite you to say, we know that there's mutuality, we know there's flourishing, and we can name that. And I'm just wondering if you might, I suppose it's a yes and that I'm inviting you into, but there's also work on ourselves, not just what we do out there.
Oh, absolutely. And it is really, I suppose it was really looking at that is what kind of drove me to ultimately to kind of write the book. I mean, as a therapist, I'm much more comfortable listening, being the one who invites others to tell their stories. The kind of act of putting my own story out in the world has actually been quite uncomfortable. But it was having children of my own, really, and kind of looking at the world and wondering what future there would be for them, what their future might look like. And understanding the power of story, and understanding the power of our internal landscape to shape our external landscape, because really that is our great power as humans. That's our species' significant power, is the might with which we can shape the landscapes that we inhabit. And many other species, lots of other animals do that, but we can do it on a scale that other species don't quite manage. And the reason, the structures that we build for ourselves externally are all manifestations of the stories that we have created internally, the ones that derive from our internal landscapes. And so when I was, it was really a compulsion to kind of write this book. It sort of felt like an act of madness. It came to me, and I felt like I really just had to sort of put this out into the world. And in the way that happens with these things, the path to receive it was just kind of very clearly laid out. I was sort of looking, you have to do this bit when you write a book proposal where you look at comparative and comparable, and you sort of have to look at the market and, name what your book might sit among for the publisher who's thinking about selling the book. And there was nothing from a Black Caribbean tradition in the UK. There's one book that I know of that exists in the US by the amazing Jamaica Kincaid. But I thought that's so interesting, because the relationship between the land in the Caribbean and the land here in England is so intimate, so fraught. It is the narrative on which our modern day society is built, and yet gosh, that story is not, it's not there. It's not out there. How interesting and how sad, because of course, when we don't, in my background as a therapist, we're compelled to repeat the mistakes that we do not or are not able to sit down and examine and process and really begin to think about and integrate into ourselves in healthier and newer ways. We just are forced to repeat those patterns, to repeat them again and again. And, I didn't actually know a lot of English history. I realized before. Interestingly, I knew more English history than I knew of the history of my native land, because we are an English colony, and our history at the time when I was at school was definitely sold to us in terms of which English governor had come and ruled from this year to that year. And there was very little about the original, the indigenous people, the first people. And there was quite a moving moment for me, which I do kind of write about in the book, was discovering through a cousin of mine who was also interested in stories, my own indigenous great-great-grandmother, and kind of realizing, there is a story that kind of ties me to this place in a very profound kind of way. And, that maternal line. But we really, really need very desperately to change the stories that we are telling ourselves about who we are, what we are, how we are in relationship to one another and to place, because it is those stories that shapes it. Society is a story. It's a story that we all kind of buy into and believe the rules of and enact. That is just what it is, really. We are excellent storytellers, and so if we can find beautiful and compelling, and I say new, but really often they're old. They're the old stories. Exactly, but it's a remembering, and in many, many ways, it's really a remembering. And a reconnecting to real meaning, what makes our lives really meaningful, what gives us real purpose as human animals on this planet. Like, that's really what it is. It's not reinventing the wheel. The wisdom is there for us, which is one of the things that also can make it feel quite sad, that actually the stories are there. We just need to remind ourselves of them. But so that the power of our internal landscape to shape our external landscape, but also the power of our external landscape to shape our internal landscape, was again another one of the things that drove me to feel quite passionate about not just writing this book, but also kind of, I guess, making the personal life decision to live in the countryside, which I'm the only Black woman in my village in the countryside. I felt quite nervous about making the leap. I wasn't sure what I would find waiting for me there. I thought it might all be a bit Wicker Man. As it turns out, very often it's like an episode of The Archers. Most weeks, in fact. But there, again, was some research that I was familiar with, that I had encountered very early on in my training as a psychiatrist, about rates of schizophrenia in the UK, and the highest risk population for developing schizophrenia in the UK is Black Caribbean. Actually, not people like me who were born in the Caribbean, but my children, first generation Black British of Caribbean heritage. And, a wildly higher rates of developing schizophrenia compared to anyone else really in the UK, and compared to people living in the Caribbean. So, and I remember kind of receiving this fact in a lecture and just thinking, like, what? And the lecturer was just really blasé, just kind of called out this number, moved on to the next thing, 9 times as high. And I was like, that's wild. Like, why is that? And even when even if you correct for things like bias in diagnosing, and it still remains that there is this higher risk. And one of the factors that was thought to contribute quite a lot to it was urbanicity, living in cities. So then actually I was living in a city when I initially got pregnant and had my children, and I looked at my baby boy and kind of thought, oof, 9 times the risk of developing schizophrenia if we're living in a city. Maybe we could try the countryside. And actually seeing, kind of watching my children embody a relationship with the land, and sort of feeling that actually there is a real profound sense of belonging that exists for them in having that kind of direct relationship with the natural world. That might have been, that Sydney where we moved from would have been harder. I would have had, it would have just been harder to achieve that. I can sort of feel why that does reduce some of the risk. But those kinds of injustices, it is maddening to exist on this land as someone of Black Caribbean heritage. And I don't think that that's not a coincidence. That is because of all of the traumas that exist in relationship to this place and this land and the Caribbean and that land, the bodies that were forced to be in quite toxic relationship with that land, extracting, working on the plantations, that kind of forced growing relationship. Even though a lot of the, I've read about how the people who were brought over, the enslaved, it wasn't an accident, that actually they were really good at farming. That's why they were chosen to kind of work the plantations. But then you have all this fallout, when slavery was abolished. In theory, of course, it lives on in our psyches and in the kind of internal stories that we tell ourselves. People left the land, in Sydney and Trinidad. There is currently being a revival to farming and to a reclamation of that relationship with brewing in the young people, which is beautiful to see. But certainly when I was a child, and I think certainly like my grandmother's generation, it was a shameful thing to be a farmer. You would not, that would be a dirty act, She did love gardening. She felt that pull, but her garden was a very English garden, actually. She grew roses in the Caribbean. They looked awful. They did not thrive in the heat, but that was the story that had been sold to her. So it is out of very much a wish to, because really what I hope that the book does is invite people really to examine their own relationship between their internal and external place, and to hopefully then challenge the stories that they have, to kind of question the stories that they kind of carry, and hopefully dream into new ones, as through touching the soil, through feeling loved by a patch of earth and loving it back.
Is this breakout time? Yeah.